There has been no nation, army, or individual who has changed human history to the degree that Jesus has. And his popularity is still very evident today. For better or for worse, you will literally find Jesus in every corner of society. You'll find him in cinemas, as over 100 movies have been made about him. You'll find him in music, as everyone from the Beatles to Justin Bieber have sung about him. And you'll find him in long-running animations like South Park, Family Guy, and The Simpsons. Now, if your image of Jesus was only based on the depictions of modern culture, I would be a little bit concerned, as I believe Jesus' character and personality to be crucially important for two reasons. One, it's recorded that he claimed to be the Son of God. So if Jesus is the real deal, then if you get to know what he is like, you get to know what God is like as well. And two, it's not just a question, can I believe in him? But more importantly, can I trust him?
Personally, I chose to follow Jesus, his teachings and his example, not just because I found compelling evidence to believe in him, but because I found the person of Jesus to be compelling. So allow me to tell you 3 really interesting encounters that Jesus had with certain individuals, because you can tell a lot about someone by the way they treated people.
In the Bible, the Gospel writer John tells a beautiful and heartbreaking story about a woman who was caught in adultery. The penalty at that time was to be stoned to death.
One day, a bloodthirsty mob came to Jesus with a half-naked woman in tow. She had been dragged from the scene of the crime, one guilty half of the offending couple, and thrown at his feet. While she is the subject of the conversation, she is not the target. The religious leaders think that they have found a way to trap and ruin Jesus. She's just a pawn in their plot to discredit him. Jewish law said that she should be stoned to death, but the Romans were rulers over the Jews at that time, and their law did not allow the Jews to execute people.
They are hoping for one of 2 scenarios. Scenario 1 would involve Jesus saying, "Stone her." Then they could report him to the governor and have him punished, maybe even killed by the Romans. Scenario 2 would involve Jesus saying, "Let her go." Then they could say that he's not sticking to the law and therefore cannot be trusted as a teacher. They believe they have forced a choice: execution by the Romans or punishment by the community.
Jesus is not particularly alarmed or panicked by the situation. He just leans forward and begins to write in the dirt. Then he straightens up and says to the crowd, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Suddenly the scene goes quiet. Jesus keeps writing and says nothing. The disciples watch with wonder. The woman tries to cover herself and closes her eyes, waiting for the stones to start raining down upon her. The crowd, standing with white-knuckled hands, holding primitive weapons, had their eyes turned from the broken woman before them to the brokenness within them. As they do, they begin to loosen their grip on their stones, drop them, and walk away. The scene that they leave behind is a half-naked woman struggling with her mistakes, and sitting in a circle of stones before Jesus, the one man who, as far as she could tell, did have the right to judge her. He looks up to her and says, "Does no one judge you?" "No one, sir," she replies. "Neither do I, but go now and leave your life of sin."
I learned so much about Jesus from this particular encounter because he doesn't react as you might expect. On the one hand, both the woman and the crowd are guilty of sin. The crowd are displaying their sin through their judgment, their anger, their arrogance. The woman through adultery. Yet Jesus doesn't judge her like the rest. He neither reaches for his black book of people's screw-ups, nor does he bend down and pick up one of those rocks. Instead, he sets her free from the judgment of others, disarms the angry crowd, and invites her to start life afresh by leaving her life of sin. Jesus showed us that there is no mistake big enough that he can't forgive, and no situation that he can't turn around. People can do crazy things around celebrities. The Irish, however, are quite unique. For the most part, we tend to do very little. I remember when I was out to dinner with a friend and his favourite celebrity walked in. And despite all of my encouragement, he wouldn't even go over to the guy. He didn't want to bother him. Jesus became something of a first-century celebrity. When he entered towns or small villages, people, unlike my shy Irish friend, would go bananas. Word would spread and people would come from far and wide, bringing their sick, hoping that Jesus would heal them.
In Mark's Gospel, we hear of a woman who acted very differently from the rest of the crowd. She was not going bananas, but instead quietly doing all she could to avoid the crowd, and at the same time doing what she could to connect with Jesus.
You need to know her story to understand her actions. She had suffered for 12 years with a bleeding disorder. That was hard enough to live with, but it was made worse by the religious rules that piled hardship upon her. According to the temple purity laws, anyone with a bleeding disorder was considered ritually unclean, and people would literally avoid you. So not only did it cause isolation for her, but everything that she touched or everywhere that she sat would become unclean too. Can you imagine being a source of uncleanness, as if you could contaminate someone? Life-giving actions that we take for granted, like a pat on the back, a hug, or a kiss, are now a crime that leads to isolation and disconnection from others. For this lady, it is extremely unfair. In her pursuit of healing, though, she's willing to take the risk. She would have heard the rumors that Jesus is coming because everybody would have been talking about it.
People say he can heal the blind, make the deaf hear, make the lame walk. She would have known that these stories sounded like the Messiah. For hundreds of years, there had been prophecies in the Jewish Old Testament scriptures about a man who would be sent from God to bring rescue, healing, and transformation. So as everyone else is trying to get his attention, no one notices her as she sneaks closer and closer until she can reach out and grab the corner of his clothing. As she does, she feels that something has changed within her. Overjoyed, she turns to make her exit until she hears a voice saying loudly, "Who touched me?" The crowd are confused because they're all touching her, something that the disciples are quick to point out. "Everyone is touching you, Jesus. That's what happens in crowds." "No," he replies. "Someone touched me. I felt power go out from me." Jesus sensed her desperation in a way that the disciples never could. As the Gospel writer Mark puts it, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, she fell before his feet and told him the whole truth. I can just imagine how long it would have been since she was noticed, since she was truly seen by those around her. Her condition didn't just mean that she was viewed as dirty, it meant that she was ignored.
This is the beauty of Jesus. It's not enough that her bleeding disorder is healed. He wants her to be known again. He's not made unclean by her touch, nor is he offended by her approach. He says, "Who touched me?" because he wants her to be free from the stigma of her illness. And he invites her to tell her story in front of the watching crowd, because right there and then her reintegration into the community is happening. He didn't just stop the bleeding, he stopped the isolation and he stopped the exclusion. This encounter tells me that with Jesus, I'm not just another number. I'm not an item to be crossed off a to-do list. I'm not another nameless face in a crowd. I'm an individual. I'm someone he wants to get to know and be transformed by the encounter.
I remember after passing my driving test, I had to give my mum lifts everywhere. I remember on these journeys that she would often ask me a ton of faith-based questions. At that time, I was still working out what I believed. I knew loads about Jesus and the Bible, but I had questions about both. Now, over time, my faith grew stronger, but I have to admit that I have worked through some pretty serious doubts, and still do.
My mum really wanted me to believe because it meant so much to her. And it can mean a lot to many people in our lives. And so when we struggle with faith, it can sometimes feel like we're letting them down. But doubt, it's always been part of faith, and it always will be. It's natural, it's real, and it's something that Christianity embraces. All right, push me. After Jesus rose from the dead, he walked from his tomb and he appeared to his disciples. Well, most of his disciples. When they saw him, they were blown away. Their tears of grief became tears of joy. They saw the holes in his hand and in his side. They heard his voice, and their faith was restored. One disciple was not there. His name was Thomas. Over the next few days, the disciples would come to Thomas and tell him their story, what they had seen, what they had heard, and what they had felt. But Thomas said,
Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.
Too often when people have been teaching this story, they talk about Thomas in harsh and unfair terms. They call him Doubting Thomas and say that he should have just obeyed and believed. But let's put ourselves in Thomas's shoes, or sandals. If you or I lost someone that we loved, and our family came to us and said, "You'll never guess what, they are back. They died, but are alive again." How weird would it be if you just said, "Cool"? Immediately, your family or friends would wonder, do you even care? Without seeing, you would struggle to believe. Not because you don't have enough faith, but because you have so much love for the person, you can't risk going through the pain of losing them again, of hoping and being disappointed.
I think that's what happened with Thomas. It was a question of his heart. It wasn't as if he was anti-Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus again and believe again. It's just he didn't want to lose him again. And Jesus was so considerate to Thomas. He appeared to him in person and he didn't criticize him for not believing. He didn't give him a list of reasons for why he should have believed. He said, "Here, touch my wounds. Touch the places where the nails have pierced." He gave Thomas the opportunity to believe again, to hope again. I love that Jesus chose compassion over criticism. The God who became man and suffered death for us revealed his scars in order to meet Thomas where he was at. And he also said, "You believe because you have seen. Blessed are those who will believe without seeing." When Jesus said this, he was talking about us, people today. He was saying he knows how hard it can be to believe, how hard it can be to hope. But I love this encounter, and I can relate to it so well. I think many of us can. Jesus set Thomas free from the need to pretend that he had no doubts. He gave Thomas the permission to be honest, to own his doubts, ask the questions, and seek the answers. In one sense, we can never truly know what Jesus was like, as we weren't there 2,000 years ago. But what we do have are 4 historical accounts of his life, which speak of his incredible kindness and love. Even the ancient historians of that era back this up. The historians Pliny and Lucian record him as a wise and well-respected teacher, while Josephus even talks about his wonderful works. Some say that Jesus was just a wise man, a great religious teacher. But no wise man has ever claimed to have the authority to forgive sins like Jesus did with the woman caught in adultery. And no wise man has ever known, in advance, the inner details about countless people like Jesus showed with the suffering woman. And no wise man has ever risen from the dead, sought out his most doubting and hurting followers, showed them his wounded hands and feet, and whispered to them and said, "Believe me, it's true."